Welcome everyone to this episode of the 2020 lecture series at the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. My name is Doretta Sobolewski and I'm the research coordinator here at the museum. And today I am very pleased to have my dear colleague Eric Wilson from the Rockbridge Historical Society with me, who will speak about Black lives at Natural Bridge in Rockbridge County, Virginia. And this talk is actually based on a collaboration with Natural Bridge State Park and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts for their 2021 exhibit on Natural Bridge and American art. And I'm quite excited to learn more about it. But as always, before we get started, I would like to thank Virginia Humanities for supporting this lecture series and their tireless efforts to enhance our understanding of Virginia's histories, cultures, and traditions. We've been very fortunate to have received support from Virginia Humanities for the 2020 lecture series. So thank you, Virginia Humanities. If you would like to support programs like our lecture series, please consider giving to the American Frontier Culture Foundation. On our website, the donate button is located in the lower left corner. And if you're watching this lecture on our YouTube channel, the link is included in the comment section. And we are so grateful for your support and really appreciate you watching this lecture. And we do these programs for you. So send us an email or leave us a comment and tell us how you like this one or any of the other lectures. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker, Eric Wilson. Eric has been executive director of the Rockbridge Historical Society since 2012, and he serves as the state director of history, state director for history with the Virginia Association of Museums. Growing up in Charlottesville, he earned his graduate and undergraduate degrees in English and American literature at Harvard University and Brown University, and was awarded research fellowships for advanced study at the Folger Shakespeare Library and the Emmanuel College at the University of Cambridge. After teaching appointments at Harvard and Boston College, Eric moved to Lexington to teach in the English department at Washington and Lee University, with courses in Shakespeare, Renaissance literature, women's studies. As a member of the history and English faculties at Norfolk Academy, he designed interdisciplinary courses ranging from African American studies and urban studies to modern European history and Irish literature. Since returning to Rockbridge County, he's also taught English classes and directed interactive learning projects in the city and county's elementary, middle, and high schools. He's a founding board member of the Portsmouth Colored Community Library Museum in Portsmouth, Virginia, and the Miller's House Museum of Transportation and Industry in Lexington, Virginia. And today's talk is entitled Revisiting Virginia's Frontier Icon, Black Lives at Natural Bridge, from Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson to the Green Book. Welcome, Eric, and thank you so much for being here and all you do for museums and history education in Virginia and especially our area. Before we get started, can you tell us a little about the exhibit that the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts is putting together and how you got involved with that?
Yeah, it's an exciting partnership, and I would just echo thank you to your institution, Frontier Culture, for being a leading regional organization and leader in the state and the Virginia Humanities. It's really important that our different organizations and approaches come together in different projects. And for this particular constellation, Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and particularly curator Christopher Oliver, is putting together an exhibit that'll open in February, an opening lecture on February 5th. I believe that will be virtually accessible. An exhibit that will run for 6 months in August, and it's called Virginia Arcadia, the Natural Bridge in American Art. So it's going to be a pretty major exhibit. It'll travel to the Taubman Museum next year, maybe beyond. And obviously here in Rockbridge County, you know, we're going to be an important source for that. So from the Rockbridge Historical Society's point of view, we had done an exhibit. I think we had it up from 2014 to 16 maybe, about images of the Rock Bridge. It was about the time Natural Bridge State Park was coming into being, and we've worked with them on a number of projects, educationally and programmatically, including one in February 2019, which feels about 13 years ago right now. It was for Black History Month, and my colleague and now board member Matthew Jackson, who's a park ranger there, he and I collaborated for Black History Month in thinking about how to focus some of the narratives about Natural Bridge that are more familiar through art, through leisure and tourism, from the perspectives of focusing on some of the Black African-American colored people over the arc of time as they've been variously defined, both as visitors, as workers, as residents, as congregations in the area. So in the past year and a half, I guess it's been, the project's morphed in a few ways. And today, for this frontier themed lecture series, I want to sink in a bit more on the earlier side. There's some important things about mid-20th century tourism and labor and the neighborhoods that have still call the area home in southern Rockbridge County. But the theme of frontier is one that I want to take up, and thinking not just about where we define the frontier or when we define the frontier, but in relation to whom. Who has access to the frontier? Who has mobility? Who doesn't? And I think asking that at several points chronologically, 18th, 19th, 20th century, but also thinking about what areas are either coming to the bridge or are at the bridge and serving the area or moving beyond. That's a kind of broader framework that I think this project has the capacity to open up. So we do hope you'll see that exhibit. We've got 6 months, hopefully vaccines make that more and more possible. There's also an extraordinary catalog. I've just seen the proofs of it. So if you're not ready to make that in person, find your way to that book. They've done an excellent job on that, and we'll see how we can make that happen. So again, thanks for making this happen. Appreciate it.
Yeah, sounds great. I'm really, really excited for that. I'm looking forward to seeing it. So, but now we are looking forward to hearing your talk.
All right, I will begin sharing, and if you can just confirm you're seeing 3
Yep.
images here. Great.
Perfect.
Okay, so I've variously titled this project. It's a mouthful of a title, okay? As I say, it's in part because it wants to be quite expansive in concept and in chronological reach. And there's also an element that's really about envisioning Natural Bridge, and in part that's about visiting Natural Bridge, and then also about living and laboring at the bridge, okay? Certainly the frontier icon of the Rockbridge, of Natural Bridge, of Great Bridge, as it's been called, is one of the 7 natural wonders of the world. And we can track that from the early 19th century wallpaper we'll see here to some of the iconic photography that gets done over the course of the 19th century, and its appearance in the Green Book, the Negro Motorist Green Book, among many other kinds of travel brochures. So that's kind of the arc of where we're headed. Lots of thanks here. When I say these are partner organizations, I really mean it. One of the nice things about a recorded lecture here is, pause on these, give them credit. I'm not going to run through them all. I will call attention to the top right here. These are folks who really gave personal witness, oral histories, shared their family histories, photography, to really take this in a profound direction, as well as First Baptist Church in Natural Bridge and the state park. So thank you to all of these groups and ahead. We're doing it. Okay, I just noted, this question of how we think about the frontier, how we revision it. I think people are familiar with the Frederick Jackson Turner thesis about westwardness and American promise and the democratic spirit, and we can take that for what it is, and we can question it, and we should on both fronts. But that where, when, and for whom, I'd like people to think about that as we go. I think a traditional way of thinking about that frontier is you start with labor and you move toward leisure, right? You clear the forest, you cultivate the land, you build your home, and finally you get the comforts of home. Okay, and I think there are ways in which we can see that with Natural Bridge. What kinds of labors does it take to secure this as a place of leisure? But I'd also like to think about the ways in which we almost move backwards. If you say Natural Bridge in this area, and a lot of it, certainly beyond this area, a lot of people are going to think tourism and things you don't think about first, maybe in that, like how do you get there? Not just your car, but what roads, what kinds of access points allow that to happen. And in the early 19th century, you certainly see that. But in the 20th century, the ways in which transportation and race are part of that equation as well. I really want to think about transportation and tourism, both from the labor perspective, but also the consumer's perspective. The interplay between, let's call ourselves natives. I didn't grow up here, but to an important sense, I'm a resident. Related to people who come from outside the area to visit the bridge once in their lifetime, or perhaps ritually, as a kind of resort. In related ways, but somewhat different, how do we see the Rockbridge as a local feature? It took me living in Rockbridge County a couple years to really put together that the Natural Bridge is Rockbridge. And in doing these exhibits, I'm not alone. So maybe that says I'm not native here, but there is a local element to it, a local set of experiences, people who work at the hotels, who go ice skating regularly, live in the neighborhood, but also its global status from the Jeffersonian moment. He's writing to Angelica Schuyler, of all people, abroad, saying, you need to come see Natural Bridge. You need to come see me at Natural Bridge. So the local global element. And then, quite sure how to put this exactly. I think individuals and institutions is important. We can tell the story of Thomas Jefferson and the bridge, or we could tell the story of the man he hired, the free black man, Patrick Henry, as individuals, or we can look at institutions like farming, or tourism, or stagecoaches, or churches that are related to this area. And I think that's an important way of thinking about this as well. I think the individuals are crucial for telling the stories, and they're engaging. But frontiers aren't built just on, Davy Crockett's and Lewis and Clark's. They're built on networks and institutions as well. And I think this provides a grounding point to look that through. So kind of a lot to kick off there, but hopefully you're going to hear me touching on those words, those terms as we go in different ways. Okay, 2 core questions. How do you come to see the bridge? Like, how do you get there? And literally, how do you envision this? What is the difference between seeing and writing and working? And who's there? Right? There is a tradition that says you come alone and you see this unpopulated bridge and, wow, it's sublime. But actually, that's pretty rare. And even if there are no people there at the moment, how do you see the traces of human activities and cultivation and culture that frame this natural bridge? So again, the people within the nature is really important here. If I think about how I came to see the bridge, I'm going to give you 3 quick images here. This is probably what I would say the most famous image of the bridge. Christopher Oliver may have a different take, but it's certainly profound. I grew up in Albemarle County. This painting was about a block from the church I grew up in. It's the vision of the bridge I grew up with. And frankly, I focused, as most people, on this span, right? This big, huge, inviting ellipse. And then gradually you're like, oh yeah, there are people there. Or if you look super, super closely on your screen, there's a fence rail at the top. Like, why would you need a fence rail at the top? Transportation, travel. Okay. How did these people get down here in the clothes they're wearing? These are not questions I was asking when I was 10, but I think I'm prepared to now. When I came to live in Rockbridge, this has really been the one that's become my favorite. It's a more expansive vision. It's one that takes in the county. It's one that clearly focuses on the bridge and still looks west. I think much more expansively looks to a certain frontier. It's the same vision looking through the bridge to the west, but it's different here. And again, it didn't take me a couple years, but took me a little while to say, oh yeah, that's a road. And oh yeah, those are sheep. Like, how does sheep get there? Oh, maybe it has something to do with that house, right? That this is a cultivated space. These are cleared fields. This is not the wild sublime that Jefferson writes about and others write about. It's this mid-level, right on the front edge of the Civil War. And we're going to come back to that. Okay, so this is kind of the bridge as I come to see it. But third, this is kind of the bridge a lot of us know too, as consumers, as commerce, right? You pay your ticket price, you have a meal at the cafeteria, you buy your sweatshirt or your snow globe. I asked my daughter this morning, I think she was the last third grade class in our county, or the last really of any kids to take their school field trips there and see the wax museum before it closed. It was very much part of the experience of the bridge. And it's a different experience in the state park now or the historical society, but that's a real part of the experience that we can take seriously. And I'm very glad that when Joretta Heckscher presented programs with us, she brought an extensive collection of ashtrays and postcards and all these sorts of things. We get sent these all the time from people who say, oh, I thought the County Historical Society might want this. And even in the exhibit in our state's Fine Arts Museum, right? It's a state institution, they're making space for these kinds of things too. So those are kind of what I came to it with, but in the past few years, it's this perspective on African-American histories around the bridge, but more broadly that our historical society is working to flesh out and to add and complicate and give more voices to the narrative. There are a few ones that really help me see there are other sides to the story. There are other voices in the story. We'll come back to most of these in more depth. This is Jefferson's granddaughter in 1817 writing to her sister about a trip where a man named Patrick Henry, a free mulatto, someone who was hired by Jefferson in 1817 to take care of our lands, is their guide. He's entrusted to keep the key of the shot tower where they're making ammunition. Okay, so you see Patrick Henry and you think, well, yes, that's a voice of liberty. And I think we should think of this Patrick Henry as his own voice of liberty and possibility, not radical freedom, but one who is able to negotiate his own terms of land tenure and labor to buy his wife's freedom, to raise 2 children, and to create his own life in a tradition in Natural Bridge. That was a really important step. In 2014, we were putting our exhibit together. This image too, this is a stereoscope. If you think old viewfinders, right? You look through the viewfinder and you'll see these people remarkably in depth. It can be hard to read race, to read skin tone through photography, through painting at very small scales. But certainly this is a colored baptism. It was noted in 1898 in the creek. Probably 100 people gathered here, men and women, very well dressed for an important event. probably coming from the nearby church or people they knew. This was a story to tell, right? This is like at the height of Jim Crow, right? This is 4 years before the 1902 Virginia Constitution rolls back, all the kinds of promise of voting rights that had come out through Reconstruction, okay? And yet this is a real claiming of space and tradition and spiritual community. To find that Natural Bridge showed up in the Negro Motorist Green Book, right in the middle of the 20th century. It makes a certain sense. Automobility becomes important for most Americans at this time, but how that's negotiated and where you can stay when you cannot stay at the hotel, right? When you cannot swim in the swimming pools, where does that happen? Either in businesses or in the homes of people who take in tourists as part of their own domestic economy in support of, frankly, national tourism and trade. And lastly, I mentioned some of the people who are writing these histories, Pat Wright, Naim Ziad, who has been especially helpful in talking these through. This is a 500-page book. It's in Washington and Lee Special Collections. It's in the Library of Virginia. It came out right after we had done this program, and I've learned so much from it. It solved so many questions that I've had. And a number of the people who I think there are in these pages and their family are. And it really stitches together a lot of these things in very important ways. So this was, I would say, a pivotal point in my own journey of understanding the bridge and the people and patterns that still shape it today. So we'll kind of move chronologically. Like I say, we'll mostly be in the 19th century or kind of the late 18th for a while. And maybe some of the 20th century stuff will kind of fuel back in through Q&A. Here's a rather stiff portrait of Jefferson. I've seen better, but it tells its own story. I mean, who's the star of the show here? Well, Jefferson's front and center, but relative to other images you see of him, certainly the bridge is almost, it's like his spouse in a certain way here. And it demands, mind you, this is 2 years before the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? Or 2 years before the Louisiana Purchase. But we are looking west. Jefferson has owned this piece of property since 1774. He buys it from King George III for a song. Of course, that's 2 years before he kind of, says, King George, go away. And, maybe he could have just requisitioned it. He does purchase it. He's not here a whole lot. This is often where narratives of the bridge start, either with the Monacan traditions, and there was some Monacan settlement there and oral histories, and those are important to take on. And I don't know that we'll get much there today, but often what Jefferson says in the notes on the state of Virginia about the bridge, the most sublime of nature's works, is a grounding point. But for today's purposes, 1817 is probably the first time he met Patrick Henry and needed him. He needed Patrick Henry to keep people from timbering his land, and people weren't paying their rents, and he was kind of a key figure that Jefferson trusted. So here's that letter I mentioned. Jefferson's granddaughter, two granddaughters, also Ellen, travel over from Poplar Forest, Lynchburg. It's a 2-day journey over the mountains. It's her first time there. I love that she calls him Grandpapa, right? And I'm going to start, we'll come back to her in a second. I just want to note, Henry, this is a new sign that's going up at the state park. I think it's really nicely done. A student at Virginia Tech did this. I know you can't read it, but pause on it, zoom in, or come to the park which is open and outdoors and enabling. And read Henry's story. Okay, he purchased, he was born enslaved in Westmoreland County. He sort of was meant to be freed by his owner, but his owner's brother didn't do it when he died. So it wasn't until 1811 that he purchased his own freedom. 4 years later, he purchases the freedom of Louisa and marries her. And by 1817, he negotiates with Jefferson to farm the arable land there. There's not a ton of it. It's not incredibly valuable as an agricultural investment, but to protect it. And Jefferson does this rent-free. He allows him to work the land rent-free. They both see something in this arrangement. And it's not clear whether Henry, how literate he is. There must have been some degree from the passing of letters, but he's very savvy in working with some of the key figures at Washington College, Lexington businessmen to negotiate these things and manage Jefferson's affairs, get the land resurveyed. So I want to make sure, some people have misunderstood the relationship of Henry and Jefferson and seen him as one of Jefferson's former slaves, but they're really independent arrangements that both have interests at work. So on to Cornelia. I won't read all this, you can pause on it, but I want to start. She is let's put it, a genteel Virginia girl, right? She's raised in a certain kind of luxury. Jefferson will die radically in debt, which also means the bridge gets sold off along with so much else, including Monticello. But she's growing up, with books. I mean, she's reading Shakespeare, she's drawing Desdemona. It's fascinating to me that after she gets back from meeting Patrick Henry, and she's grown up around Black people, certainly plenty, but she's drawing Desdemona and reflecting on this play. But she's growing up in a literary tradition. She's quoting Sir Walter Scott when she sees the bridge. I mean, she knows Romanticism by 1817, right? I mean, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Byron, Scott. She has absorbed this and she's producing it. This is part of her world, and it's how she describes the natural landscape. It's delightful, it's charming temperature, right? We start as picturesque and calm. It was a level part of the country. It was cleared in cultivation, okay, right? This is all that 18th century picturesque tradition. But now we're sort of moving into these things like never more surprised, rare, from that distance, halfway around the horizon, continued and unbroken, right? We're entering frontier here, okay? And she's doing that verbally through literary traditions, but also this is a girl who's drawing art, right? I mean, she has seen the bridge visually, she just hasn't visited it. I love this as an Albemarle County boy, right? How do you understand what you're seeing? You compare it to what you know. But they are not round and regular like Albemarle. They're like sugar cubes. They're perpendicular. They're difficult. They're impossible to climb. Right? This, again, is the language of the Romantic sublime. So what do you do when you're faced with the impossible? You find help, okay? And here he is. Okay, in the pouring rain, right? It's a thunderstorm. Cedar Creek is rising like a torrent. This is actually where she quotes Walter Scott. And there he is, Patrick Henry, in his proper name, right? His full first and last name. He lives there, very specific about whose land. He keeps the key of the shot tower. During the War of 1812, Jefferson leased out the bridge to a man, Dr. Thornton, who is literally making bullets by dropping down molten lead, from that height, and they scoop out bat guano from the caves, to make gunpowder. I mean, it's this odd little industrial place, but it's Henry, who's the keeper. And I just love this phrase, he went with us. You know, I mean, yes, it's a statement of fact, but it's a comfort, it's an intimacy. He's a guide. Okay, he's a guide. And to me, it's a moment where Patrick Henry kind of becomes my guide through this place. You know, it's like, how am I going to navigate this vicariously? It's not, you know, I'm not Cornelia. I'm sort of walking with Henry myself. Okay, up on the precipice, or looking up at the precipice first. You can't conceive of it. And then looking down, again, how does she compare this? It's like all she could think of is looking down a well, right? She knows what it's like to look down a well on a plantation, but she has not seen this dizzying height. And yet, we stood on the edge and looked down with perfect safety. Right? If the frontier is about risk in important ways, about risk and opportunity, and surprise and encounter, there is safety here, there is assurance, there's a different kind of opportunity. Okay, maybe the last one, here's the rising water. Are we going to be able to do this? If it had not been for the exertions, the labor, right? Like not just the efforts, the exertions. He worked for an hour to build a bridge under the bridge, laying planks, right? To really make this, I mean, I don't know what Cornelia is wearing, but it's a dress of some complication, some sort. We'll see that. He makes it passable and comfortable and memorable, that she wants to keep talking about him. It would be easy for her to not talk about who helps this journey along the way, right? She doesn't really talk about other kinds of labor, but Henry figures here importantly. So to tie this together, there have been a couple different ways of thinking about who Henry is. One of RHS's, Rockbridge Historical Society's trustees, did an article about Patrick Henry and Jefferson and Rockbridge, and really locally looking at that understanding. I think a year ago, Arthur Scher did a piece that was really looking at Jefferson's beliefs about race and equality, and wanted to say, late in life, how can we use Jefferson's relationships to a free Black man to assess or gauge what Jefferson thinks about Black people, their capacity, their intelligence? How does that square earlier? It's a complicated article in lots of ways, but it does some excellent work, excellent archival work on the back end of really looking at the bottom here. William Carruthers, the businessman, William Graham, the professor, the county surveyor, and how both Jefferson and Henry are using them. I'd also like to look, in some ways, I think both those approaches say Patrick Henry is an exception, and he is. Okay, we're working here on some histories of free Blacks in Rockbridge County and really fleshing out that story. But the relationship between a president and a free Black man who's managing his property is in important ways exceptional. And yet, what if we look at Henry in different ways, a bit on his own terms? What if, as Matthew Jackson, who's the ranger at Natural Bridge State Park, says, what if we think of him as a first park ranger who's actively working in conservation and land management, protecting the timber and the soil quality, and he's clearly a tour guide? I mean, Jefferson, I just learned this the other day, Jefferson tips him on that trip with Cornelia. He gives him a shilling, in effect. No, he gives him $1. He gives him $1, just not bad. So what if we see Henry in his own right in that way? And what if we understand him in genealogical terms? This summer, I heard from a professor at UC Berkeley someone who's named Charles Patrick Henry. And he's within one link of, assuring how these Henry ties. But if you look at those early ties, it's all Patrick Henry's. There's a genealogy here that is fascinating. It's telling too that Charles Patrick Henry today is a professor of Black politics, national Black politics, and international Black politics. He's internationally, he was a State Department appointee, I think under President Clinton. It's a neat arc to think about generational growth through education and labor. The generation after Patrick Henry, we think, moved to Ohio, as many freed and free Black families would do in that next generation. And we'll see later today that some of the descendants, the people who I interviewed and have shared their stories and have been to the church services with them, one line descends through Elizabeth Hemings. So Elizabeth Hemings is the mother of Sally Hemings, most known for her relationship with Jefferson, but through another child of Elizabeth Hemings, we come down. Brown Colbert will be a person who moves to Lexington, and his daughter is born in Rockbridge County. We can see genealogies here really within the terms of Black families, and not, chiefly trying to say, well, what does it tell us about Jefferson's views on race, right? Which is an important question, okay? But it's a different question. So I'd really like, with Henry and some of the other figures who follow in this precedent, what if we started saying he's not just, the employee of Jefferson, but he's a farmer, right? He's a spouse, he's a father. How do we understand his labor or his wife's labors in helping with the farm, right? And giving birth to 2 children and raising those children. She stays on at the bridge for a few years after Patrick Henry dies, maybe seems to take over some of the guiding work as well. So how do we start with those lives and credit them and see their credibility in these historical narratives? Okay, so we're back at that image. I noted some of these things. Henry's brother, John Henry, is a freeman in Lexington. He works at Washington College, and he's actually an advocate for his brother. He writes Jefferson at least once, maybe twice, and basically says, my brother Patrick's he's not being done right with some of the other local tenants. You need to step up and handle this. And also will be involved in Liberian colonization efforts. So we can thread that family out broadly. Henry dies in 1829 for complicated reasons of Jefferson's debt. The bridge doesn't get settled and sold till 1833, and his wife and children are still there. Okay, right about the same time, this is one of the most remarkable images I've seen, and this is in the exhibit. This is a wallpaper strip. There are a series of wallpaper pieces about North America that were produced in France. Company is called Zuber. They're still operating today. I think you can still order this. And they tag Natural Bridge, Niagara Falls, the 2 iconic places. There's images of unloading boats in Boston Harbor. They're trying to take representative scenes, okay? And so the bridge is one, but what doesn't seem representative to me are the figures who, are centered in the image here, and are these very well-dressed Black visitors, right? They do not look to be laboring in the ways that the Native American figures here. I don't know if we'd call that labor or performance or hospitality. I mean, we could see that in different ways, but what we have here look to be, they're people who are dressed like 1830s people in France, quite frankly. And this is sort of a projection, I think, of what people like DeLaney, the artist, or Alexis de Tocqueville, who's writing Democracy in America in 1835, are sort of seeing as this a new emergent country and a mixing and that frontier spirit. Are we getting these kinds of visitors at Natural Bridge in the mid-1830s? I think it highly unlikely, okay? But is that a vision of what American energies, American directions might be from Europe? Apparently. And again, it's hard to read paint pigment as skin tone, as race, as, you know, multi-race, but here there's no question that certainly these three are much darker skinned, perhaps what would have more been called, as with Henry, a mulatto figure. Here in the stagecoach, we see a range of different figures and tones. And again, I think it's important that we see the road here, right? This tells you the work and the transportation that allows you to get here in comfort. And you get here and you have entertainment as these people are sitting and watching, right? This is really setting the stage for a certain kind of tourism industry, I think, of the bridge. Fascinated by this. And I'll tell you where I got the image. It's from the San Francisco airport, which right now has an online exhibit of all of these in the airport. So they've got them up, but I love, there's a wonderful digital exhibit, which just completely makes the point about physically traveling, right, through stagecoach or airplane or Zoom, but also imaginatively traveling. And for us, traveling back through time, right? To put this wallpaper up was not to travel through time at the moment, but across space, right? Across the Atlantic, and maybe like what lies out there in the, you know, we're starting to push toward bigger and bigger mountains than the Alleghenies. And the bridge shows it, frankly. Tourism, transport, labor. This is a chair that Rockbridge Historical Society owns. This is being loaned to the exhibit. It's the featured piece of decorative arts. It was owned by a very important local writer, Margaret Junkin Preston, the daughter of the president of Washington College, who leaves at secession, but his daughter will marry the founder of VMI. His other daughter marries Thomas Jonathan Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. She'll become an important Confederate, post-Confederate writer, and this is the chair that she owned. And the style of furniture, Baltimore painted fancy chairs, fancy furniture, was fairly common among a certain class. And the research that VMFA helped us with and the conservation that they did, I should have a before and after. It's really, the red has really come out. The gold is popping. We know from the chemistry department, there's real gold in the gold. I don't know how much, but it's nice to know. And most importantly, looking here at the bridge, we really didn't see this second mountain range and some of the things in the pool of water. The cleaning really opened up things, the tree work up here. So the range of ways from ceramics to furniture to wallpaper, this is before photography. And really before a big tradition of 19th century oil painting is setting in. You know, we're proud to own that and interpret that. And as with Cornelia Jefferson, we can tell this as part of women's histories in this era as well, and how their voices, their tastes, their advocacy is part of a Virginia story as well. So there's our chair in full. Again, really grateful to the museum, the conservators, the researchers. This is the postcard that Chris Oliver has put together for the exhibit. He likes that image too, I guess. And so we hope you'll see that. And this is the catalog that I mentioned. So again, that Frederick Church, sublime kind of image is a representative one. There's, I don't know, it's like a 50-page, text catalog. It's lots of great stuff that really opens up the artistic perspectives. Okay, so I said I kind of, grew up with this in a certain way. And by that, I just largely mean it's the conventional image. And as with many conventional things, we don't always see what's staring us in the face. I noted this tiny little fence and the question of how do you fence in the bridge, not just for safety, but like enclosure. If I want to charge admission, I need to fence it off. And I need to like make sure the other guy's not fencing me in. There's a fair amount of that in the 19th century. But down here, the question of race, this is clearly a white woman of some age, and I think pretty clearly an African-American man who is the guide. I mean, visually, he's the guide, right? She looks up to him. Where's my cursor? She looks to him. He takes us up there, right? He takes her up. He takes us up, right? So he's the kind of key figure. And, I can't say this is Patrick Henry and Cornelia Randolph, right? This is 1852. But I think it's of a type. And if you look at a number of the etchings in these eras, you'll see mostly Native American, but sometimes African-American figures set often further back. And then you have the more contemporary visitors. It seems to represent some kind of march of time or replacement, right? We're here now, they used to be here. Here's the timeless bridge. Seems a little different, but I don't think we should miss the questions of race here or of gender here. A pretty commonly reproduced image, 1858, just before secession. You could see here the building up of hotels, okay, as well as other houses, a lot more enclosure of land and cultivation of land. Okay, you're starting to see people. At the same time, we're still not seeing farmers. Okay, this is I would say cultivated like culture, but not labor. In important sense, is a widely distributed album of Virginia. Back to Johnson again. It's worth zooming in. You start. It's this little zigzag of the road. And is that a road or what is that? And whose house is that? But again, this is 1860. Who's working that land? Who's working the roads? I mean this somewhat because I don't know whose fields they are. I don't know the lot lines. I mean it somewhat rhetorically because enslaved people in Rockbridge County are working a lot of the land. But also I want to say that enslaved labor is involved in a range of different kinds of work, industrial forges that are in southern Rockbridge County. We're right near the James River, canal building, transportation. Okay, so I wouldn't say that David Johnson's trying to erase that labor actively, though to a certain extent, I think there's a way in which we could say these things are taken for granted until we remind ourselves to look for those blind spots that we're not invited to see in a certain kind of stereo vision. 1872, we're after the Civil War. We are a couple years into Reconstruction now. We're 5 years into Black men voting in Rockbridge County, not Black women. And this is an important broadly published book, Picturesque America. I think it's William Cullen Bryant who edits some text and poems. It's pretty much the same angle as David Johnson, right? And here you start to see workers on hay bales. I'm not going to try to read race into that. They're too small. They're figures. But this here is not a laborer. This is an artist, right? He's not carrying a hay fork. This is his easel and his walking cane and his jaunty clothing. Okay, so we're starting to see the bridge in a different way. And here is what Harry Fenn draws. Harry Fenn draws himself drawing the bridge, right? Is not underneath looking up is the common vision. Okay, he's up top in this kind of unusual, sort of wild, scraggly. I mean, mostly when I look at this, I'm looking at the tree. It's just fascinating. I'm like, oh yeah, there he is. Oh yeah, he's smoking while he's drawing. And then, oh wait, there's his easel and an umbrella. And wait, there's other people here. There's two girls here. Wait, there's a third figure here. Who is looking at the easel while he is looking at the bridge? Okay, you can see down here in very fine detail, he's got his own initials. This looks to be sort of like his portfolio of drawings. And if you look at this easel in a better resolution, you'd see it's not the bridge, right? It's not where he's sitting. He's drawing the tree that he's sitting in. It's almost like these sort of Las Meninas paintings, right? You're looking through the mirrors and the angles. And again, the gesture, we've got one person, probably a Rockbridge resident, instructing another person how to see, just as we saw in the Frederick Church painting. Both of them are girls, barefoot, fairly rough clothing, okay? And here we have a third figure, hard to read gender, very exaggerated negroid figures, we might say. This is real caricature. This is a certain kind of, you see Henry Louis Gates has written about this, a lot of people have written about this type of and a kind of merging Jim Crow, Sambo kind of visual figuration that strikes me as wholly different than what's going on in the rest of this very fine image of the bridge. It's like, why does he need to put these people here? Why does he want to? It makes it very interesting, okay? But complicated. So who are we watching? Are we watching the girls watching the image? Are we watching a sketch or a painting or an etching? It's a much more complex image than we might see. And again, that's 1872. Right? We're still during Reconstruction. Two books that really I wanted to note that have framed my thinking about this broadly. One is called Colored Travelers, and it's about Black mobility and the laws that did or didn't enable that before the Civil War. So this is not Plessy versus Ferguson, 1890s. You can see, I mean, this is the clothing we saw in the French wallpaper. And you can see these children up here and this child and this man a little puzzled by what this man is doing in this, it's hard to tell, omnibus kind of thing. Really important and useful book. And then this book by Henry Louis Gates, who's written a lot about this era, but this is a YA history book, a young adult book. And I think the way in which this book images individuals and communities and does it for a broad audience, it helped shape my thinking about how maybe to tell this story and across different generations. So I encourage those for students, adults of different ages to see that. Another book, Charles Dew wrote a groundbreaking book about industrial slavery in southern Rockbridge County, an extraordinary archive of papers at the University of Virginia. But what I want to note here, and like I can't even really get into that book, save to say that many of the enslaved descendants and descendants of free people who worked there, white and Black, still live in Rockbridge County, in the southern part of the county. Forge Road, which you'll hear about, is around there. Poor resolution here, But this man is Garland Thompson. He was an enslaved worker for William Weaver, and a number of his descendants, we see here, what is it? I forget how many children and grandchildren, you can count them. It's an iconic image. You see this in a lot of museums. But some are still living here today. An important school principal in the mid-20th century in the area. I should say Aaron Schwartz, who is a William and Mary PhD student, is focusing on women's work at Buffalo Forge. Doretta, you should get her to present at some point. It's fabulous work. It takes Charles Dew's work to a new level. She's doing interviews with some of the Thompson descendants and some of the others. One of the descendants, his wife has worked with us on a number of projects. I mentioned Elizabeth Hemmings. I won't track all the descendant lines here, but I will get to Ms. Hubbard, Ms. Nadine Hubbard, whose oral history really opened a lot of doors here and connections. She's sister-in-law to one of the figures we'll see, a kind of key profile. And her grandson is the pastor of First Baptist Natural Bridge Church, which was founded in 1865, right? It was one of the two Rockbridge County churches that were founded, one Lexington, one in the county, and right after emancipation, and continuing that tradition. So I want to emphasize, the vitality. These aren't just lives in the distant past, right? These are lives that continue and are continuing to shape the ways in which we want to tell the history, not just the life and work that is being done here. And again, the Diamond family, I showed you that book. They've been generous with their time, particularly the Dixons. I'll move quickly here. This is the picture of that colored baptism, 1898. This is produced by a studio in St. Louis, right? So these are nationally marketed. This is an image people want to see. And thanks to Seth Goodhart at Washington Lee Special Collections for loaning this. We blew this image up to about 7 feet wide at the exhibit so you could really see it. At the exhibit in Richmond, I believe they'll have a stereo opticon so you can see it in depth. When you look at these people, you don't just look at the bridge, they stare right at you. I mean, I so want to know this girl's name and this man's name. I mean, they're looking right at the camera, they're looking at me. It feels personal, right? And this is a crowd. This is a real crowd. Rarely do we see, this is a broader argument, images of African-American people as consumers or visitors in sort of public imagery or public brochures. Okay, this is one of them. Okay, the wallpaper is one of them in their own complicated ways. And I think it's part of why, I really want to unpack that. The church that it's likely many of these people are coming from is the church that I just mentioned. It's about a half mile away. In 1926, it moves to another part of the neighborhood, but there's some real vitality of institutions here. This is the daughter of Natural Bridge's owner at the time. I don't know that she's writing about that particular one. In fact, part of her point is it's not uncommon for those baptisms to happen from one of the churches, First Baptist Natural Bridge, or as it was called, the Old Colored Church sometimes, is nearby, and still standing today is Natural Bridge Baptist Church, is overlooking the visitor center. Both of those churches came here, and surely other churches in the area. She writes in ways that are characteristic of the ways in which African-American spiritualism is often described. The colored baptisms are more impressive because they seem more deeply impressed. So while Cornelia Randolph is talking about being impressed sort of visually by the sublime and you know, the wild nature, here the impression is from the spirit, okay? And Catherine Loomis Parsons, who is one of these women, I don't know which one, but that's what she's writing. Her father was crucial to the bridge. He was the 10th owner by 1881. He expanded the hotel, he invested in roads and stables. He also kind of split the property and put, I think, about half of it into a forest company, which we think of as maybe not conservation, but actually it kept the integrity of that land in crucial ways from getting cut up. And once those stables are there, that really becomes a draw for the hotel. They had 40 to 50 horses stabled there. You can see some of the stable masters there getting ready to, I mean, you got 2 little kids, right? You better take care of those little children on a horse. You better be able to manage them if you want to keep your job. So they're clearly good at that. 1890s, we start to see more sophisticated stage service from the James River and the railroads into Lexington. And here in 1906, you could see the hotel. This young figure is not the driver. You know, he's riding shotgun. These are probably Washington College students going to Lexington. But for reasons you'll see, I like to imagine that this figure might be someone named Guy Hunt. His age would maybe square, and we know that Guy Hunt did the kind of range of work as a teamster, as a hotel employee that makes it plausible and allows us to focus on the different kinds of labor that make these people's visits possible, right? That make Colonel Parsons and his daughter's livelihood there possible. This also is not Guy Hunt, but these are waiters at the hotel in 1903. Okay, clearly, you know, very assured and composed. They don't know their names, but we're looking, right? These may be possible through family histories. Here's the draft record of Guy Hunt. He's drafted in World War I, and he's listed as a teamster. We know he's colored because the corner is torn off. That's what happened to African-American men's registration cards. So his skill is identified as teamster. Here's his picture, right? As a soldier for the US Army, 1917. We know he's a soldier because he's got bullets, right? The idea that teamsters weren't really fighting, they were just support, is certainly not true in World War I, right? Often that logistical, those labor battalions were out in front of the lines, arguably more dangerous. And what blew me away, I did not see this at first, but here standing in front of a picture, and maybe even a studio picture, we've got a wagon wheel, right? It is figuring his labor. And for a man who did a lot of driving for his lifetime, who served the United States Armed Forces, who served the Natural Bridge Hotel, he certainly served his family and his church. There are a lot of threads that come together in Guy Osephort Hunt here. At the Diamond Family Cemetery, where I was able to take this picture, we see the span of his life, you know, really was from the Plessy versus Ferguson moment to the Civil Rights Act, almost. Right? He had 2 marriages and 2 sort of wings of children who have contributed to this. And we'll need to move towards wrapping soon, I think, but there's a figure I've been writing a lot about named Eliza Walker. Think of her as kind of a superhero here in Lexington. she's born in Natural Bridge, right? So she comes out of this culture. I mean, remember those little girls we saw in 1872 etched in the corner of the painting? I mean, this is really, a girl who comes out of that moment and will become one of the most prominent social leaders in Lexington. She trains as a nurse in Washington, D.C. She's a poet, she's a singer, she's a national fundraiser. She campaigns for a Chicago congressman in 1930 as a national campaign to re-elect Oscar DePriest. She's a power broker. And in the first statewide conference of the Virginia Federation of Colored Women after the 19th Amendment, right? So we just had that centennial in November 1920. Next spring, the heads of the local chapters of the Virginia Federation of Colored Women, and Eliza is the Rockbridge chapter president, they meet and convene at her home. This is her home, 2 blocks up from First Baptist Church, where they have some of their meetings. And they take an outing to Natural Bridge. Okay, so if we saw like 80 to 100 people there for a baptism, here we've got, 60, 80 Black women going on an outing to see the natural wonder and to have what is described as a delightful picnic. And I think you should also see this as Eliza Walker displaying that she has the wherewithal to navigate and negotiate that social outing, right? That this is possible and enjoyable. And I don't know how many stagecoaches it took to get down there, but it happened. Okay, so she is another agent, not just of coming from Natural Bridge and getting there, but she advocates to build an orphanage and old folks home in Lexington. This is a DC newspaper ad picturing herself, Mrs. H.L. Walker. All of us are contributing here to build the bricks. All of these names are from like Pennsylvania, Ohio, DC, Baltimore, Richmond. She's got bona fides and fundraising investments to build an orphanage. These are some of the orphans she wants to support. One of them named Virginia, even. We think this is taken on the porch of the Walker farm. Sadly, don't think the orphanage fully got built. We don't know what happened with these 3 girls. All we know is they ran away from the Rockbridge poorhouse. Okay, and here is Eliza Walker taking them in. And this image, I should have shown the other one, is on a postcard that notes at the time, it's a fundraising postcard in 1918, during World War I. She says, while Black troops like Guy Hunt are fighting for us, you all need to invest in your community and support the old folks and the young folks of our community. She's doing that during 1918. It's like fundraising in a pandemic, right? You do it because it's important, and you can only do it if you have the skills and networks to pull that off. And she does. This is her husband. Those of you who know Lexington may know this as McAdoo's. Her husband, Harry Lee Walker, was a butcher and then a store owner. He had the big contracts to sell meat to VMI, to Washington Lee, to the fraternities. And if you think about young men who are hungry, like that's who you want to sell meat to. Okay, so he's very successful. She uses stationery from his building on her fundraising campaign, right? She's using his credibility to advance hers. This is the church they invest in. Okay, they're important leaders. This is the house they buy. It's a very prominent house on the top of what was initially called Freedman's Hill, now Green Hill or Diamond Hill. And that's where that convention met. They're taking people during the summer. This is a young woman who wrote that I've spent one of my happiest summers at Blandome in 1896. Like, I want to know that story. And I think shows, and we see some of this in Natural Bridge too, young girls coming from Washington down to Natural Bridge for the air, to get away from the city or to get resort jobs. So there's some back and forth traffic there. Just want to show you the Green Book bit, and then maybe we'll sort of go to Q&A and touch on other things. I think a number of people are familiar with what was called the Negro Motorist Green Book to indicate places for Black travelers to not only accessibly but safely travel. It's not called the Green Book because the book was green. It's called the Green Book because Victor Green published it, and so he made it green. It's often misunderstood. This is 1939, the first year Lexington businesses enter the Green Book. It's the year our organization is founded. And in 1949, we first see Mountain View Cottage down in Natural Bridge. And it really was the attempt to find Mountain View Cottage that led me to meet the people who could help me do that, because it was difficult. It's not standing. There are all sorts of places called like Mountain House and Mountain Cottage and View of the Mountains. And it was really difficult to figure that out until Naim Ziad, I showed you his book, who showed it, told me, oh yeah, I worked there as a kid. I babysat for the people at Mountain View Cottage. They gave me my first bike at 9 years old. It brought into a whole relief, a capacity to find ways, not just to this site. And these are some of the other Green Book sites. You can go back to this presentation later, see some of these Lexington sites, how we're mapping them. This is going to be an interactive map through time, a walking tour by a partner organization. This is all that remains of Mountain View Cottage. And this is my colleague, Matt Jackson, as we were tromping around. There's the old roof, you know, found some spray starch and a toilet that helped us date some things. But again, it was the personal witness, that is Raggedy Ann spray starch, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. Apparently, you want to try that. That did this. Looking through the Natural Bridge Hotel archives wasn't doing that because they're not marketing Black travel. In 1939, they're marketing, you're going to Niagara or the World's Fair, or, you know, here are our new motorhomes. We can market excellent employees trained in courtesy and service, Southern hospitality. We're not marketing for Black tourists. We'll put it next to cigarette advertising. But again, these are the men here who make that possible. Here we have a man who grew up in Natural Bridge and became a head figure at the Hotel Roanoke named Theodore Carter DeLaney. His father was a head maitre d' at Natural Bridge Hotel, and his son, known to many in the area, and certainly to Virginia Humanities, was Professor Ted DeLaney. Ted was on the board. Ted was a fellow. He just died about 3 weeks ago. This is a great place to bear witness to the record of his work. Ted's done so much in unearthing and sharing to students and to scholars the histories of African-American lives in Rockbridge County. And to look at that generational arc of different types of work and different types of connection through generations. And for me, it's really been an important corrective, not just to stay anchored in Lexington. I think that's where a lot of our work has been done. So to look at the county and Rockbridge County and these ties between that sort of more the frontier of Rockbridge as integrated to what's happening here, I think holds great promise for directions we want to head in. So let me pause there and we can go from there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That is really fascinating. I mean, you've really expanded my understanding of who the stewards of the Natural Bridge land were and who claimed them for different in different ways. I mean, that picture of the Black Bass baptism in particular is absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much. And it also challenged my um, understanding of the frontier, because when you work at a museum like ours, we have a very, or we constantly think about what is the frontier, how do we define it, and then it itself is a very challenging, um, challenging thing. So we, for example, think of the frontier as a mixing space of a geographical area um, where ideas from African Americans, Europeans, and American Indians came together, and where exchanges happened, peaceful and violent. It was back and forth. But the idea of the frontier in general is a very Eurocentric notion in general. Um, I'm just as on a side note, some more modern scholars think of the frontier as an area of indigenous occupation, which got invaded by Europeans as well. So, but go ahead.
I'm really glad you used the word stewards, and I hope I did somewhere. I should have used it more. I like that word, not just in the sense of stewarding the land or stewarding the commercial enterprise, but I do want to emphasize that the stewardship of history, okay, and the families that have done this are stewarding that history in ways that we know family histories to do. And as a county historical society, we depend on that kind of genealogical work. But this has been different. This is a way, I think, of stewarding certain, not just content, but approaches to history, into, organizations and, state museums that I think are going to, credit that. And again, credit and credibility is really important. On the frontier, I think you're right. It's absolutely what I wanted to both acknowledge and broaden. I remember it was, I think, a day before either I wrote you and typed something up, or we talked on the phone. I'm driving on I-64 to Richmond, actually. And I pulled the car over because I had this idea about frontier. And it hit me with all this Green Book stuff that it was the Kennedy moment. I can't remember whether it was Kennedy or Johnson who used the phrase new frontier, right? They tried to reactivate that sense for a new moment of American promise. Of course, the moment that is, maybe call it the height of the civil rights movement, or maybe not, right? But it really should ask, is the new frontier, Apollo 11, or is the new frontier the Civil Rights Act of 1964? And so to take seriously that the frontier is not just moving westward or moving linearly forward, right? But the frontier is moving back and forth. And I'm really trying to look at, I'm fascinated increasingly in the late 19th and early 20th century. There's some kind of, call it an axis between Lexington, Natural Bridge, Rockbridge, and DC. I mean, other places, Baltimore, Pittsburgh a little bit, Richmond, people going to get work experience, educational experience coming back, families moving back. I mean, we know that to be an experience of the classical, settlers frontier. But if we try to look at that model in different ways, I think we see different people. And we see the different tools that people use to make gains and to support their families and advance them. And so just to find, these are the people, the Dixon family, they run the tourist home, the Black tourist home that I did find a lot about through the Dixon So she is the, if I'm remembering right, she's the sister-in-law to Guy Hunt, the World War I soldier. And her husband, built their home. And from the 30s into the mid 60s, really when, the Green Book stops being published with the 1965 Civil Rights Act. It's still difficult to travel across different colored lines, but they're housing dozens of guests, seating 20 people at their tables, and their home is also a farm, right? So this whole neighborhood, here's what she bought in the general store. So again, women's work here is vital to this, and they're important work early in this lecture series. The people who are working on ceramics and all sorts of things, and looking at the different types of male and female labor. This is part of it. And 1965, sometimes people think, oh, is that really history? I mean, that's, it's well over 50 years ago. So this, I think, again, is where this project may grow.
Well, that kind of leads me to another question / observation that I had. And I think this is where historical societies like Rockbridge are just so important and resourceful, is that you can span over a certain amount of time. A museum like us, we have a very defined mission, but at a historical society, it seems like that you can have exhibits or projects like this one where you look at different sources from different times. And I'm very impressed how you married these different sources. I mean, you looked at paintings and paraphernalia and oral history, and you combined that, and you span
Don't
over
forget the
such
snow globe.
That's great. Yeah. So can you talk a little about that? How do you go about that? Because in some cases you might have almost too many sources. How do you combine them? How do you select them?
There's a few more slides here too.
Yeah.
Tried to behave. A couple things. I will say for Natural Bridge, it's easier. I mean, it has that challenge, as you say, that people have been collecting the rare things about the bridge and then the mass-produced things about the bridge and writing newspapers about the bridge. One of my board members sent me last night, we're looking for like one little issue. He's like, here's 10 newspaper articles that he found like in 10 minutes. So yeah, knowing how to kind of edge it. I mean, in some ways, race is the filter here. I think it's right to put it that way. I don't think Natural Bridge is the filter on the history of Black people in Rockbridge County. You could see ways in which you would go about that. I think there's a little bit of both. But I think I am interested in this idea. You heard me say it a few times. What if we take the familiar and we take this sort of different angle on it, or what I've come to start calling a kind of double vision, that stereoscope. And if we look not just, at the chair, this nice, beautiful chair we got, but like who made that chair? Who drove that chair here? How do we use a certain kind of double vision, whether that's ethnicity or gender or social class? Historically, our historical society and museums in our area have anchored in the middle of the 19th century, right? The lead up to and the wake of a certain war. And that is crucial. And I think we can tell that story in a whole range of ways, as it has been done before, but different ways. I mean, look, comparing that David Johnson painting of 1860 and the roads of 1872, you do that, it's hard not to think about the different people who are living here, or what different people see in this place. I think it's Jaretta Heckscher who makes a point in the introduction about ways in which the Natural Bridge is alternatively seen as an American national figure or as kind of a Southern figure. Like what is distinct to the South? I mean, Niagara's up north and the North has other things, but Natural Bridge for a certain period is this distinctly Southern thing, and then kind of doesn't quite become that. And yet I will note, I glossed over it, the hospital does sell patently Southern hospitality, right? Which can either be this kind of beige and warm term or super loaded, right? I mean, who is Southern hospitality? I found these two images in a brochure, and it's like they photoshopped, the woman waiter for the Black waiter. I mean, these people haven't moved. And so the image of what we can sell, what you get out of the bridge is a Southern experience that you travel for. And, these are right around, the 1960s. It's a tricky thing. Part of me looks at this image and says, I'm not sure if that's giving this waiter full integrity. In his work, it's of a type, but I'm not sure about that. But then, looking back at those pictures of Mr. DeLaney and his father and those waiters, I mean, these clearly are men who are chosen to represent their institutions, the Hotel Roanoke. I don't know how he got chosen to represent that, but it's a big job. And here's Ted DeLaney representing his institution, a notable Southern institution that is also a national institution. So I think region, would be another way to go here. Not just, frontier often seems to be pushing us west, but in these back and forths, I think, south and back, or the other ways that I'm ready to do some thinking about.
Yeah, excellent. So since we don't have, since our viewers don't have the opportunity to ask you questions, is there a way how they can get in touch with you if they have any follow-up questions about this talk?
There's this thing called the internet.
I like the internet.
Hello through the internet. The Rockbridge Historical Society's web address is rockbridgehistory.org. So that's all one word, rockbridgehistory.org. There's a contact through there. You can do director@rockbridgehistory.org. Both of those will come to me. And we'd love to. I know by the time people are seeing this, some of the families who contributed it will be among those watching it. And I'm grateful for that. And I'll hope for additions, I'll hope for corrections. Certainly anybody who has that input. A lot of people have stakes in this place and care about the Natural Bridge. Mm-hmm. And it's really exciting to me, future of the state park. Our state budget just invested in the state park again, in a tough time. And I think that signals its importance. And so, we need those visitors, that visitation. It helps, local workers, local industries, local historical societies like ours. But do please share your input. It's been an exciting project to begin working on, and hope you'll check back. And again, do please go to the VMFA site. I think they're vmfa.org for information about the exhibit that opens on February 6th.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to include your email address in the comment section for this video. So I just want to thank you so much for a wonderful, stimulating, enlightening presentation. That was really great. And I wish you good luck with the VMFA exhibit and all other projects that Rockbridge Historical Society has in the works right now. And I also want to say a big thank you to all of our viewers. Thank you so much. I hope to see you again for the next installment of the lecture series, which will be 2021. This is the final one of 2020. And yeah, thank you so much for being viewers of our lecture series here. And I hope to see you either in person or in some of our other virtual programs at the Frontier Culture Museum. Stay safe, everyone, and see you next time.